Something is seriously changing about the way the West is approaching the war in Gaza and the genocide that's going on. I am not sure if it is just these different papers and politicians realizing that they really have to do something to save their behinds, because the genocide case in the ICJ looks as if though it might actually work out for South Africa, and that all of these people now get very jumpy. But something is seriously changing. In the last couple of days, we are seeing a complete shift in the rhetoric of what is sayable in the news media. And in this program, I want to go with you through one article in particular. That is this one here in The Guardian. A revelation and an investigative report about how Israel has been not only evading international law, but US domestic law that is supposed to prevent human rights abuses from happening. That something like this article here, which is a very good and very powerful investigation, actually real journalism in The Guardian, can you believe it? It's possible now that is surprising by itself. But if you combine it with the fact that in the last couple of days, also articles like this one are now possible in Foreign Affairs, again, one of the number one intellectual propaganda tools in the United States, that has been publishing all of this horrible stuff. And now suddenly a former foreign minister of Jordan, and later also deputy prime minister, Maran Mouasher, is able to have in here a really deep article that reads: the greater goal in Gaza for lasting peace, Israel must end its occupation of Palestinian land. I mean, can you believe it? The things, like sane things, a sane approach to the through this to this horrible slaughter is now being published in the number one propaganda outlets. And in this article, we are being told exactly what any sane person has known for many, many years, that you cannot go to a lasting peace without an actually working arrangement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I mean, read this. To understand the true scope of the day after problem, and now he talks, of course, about Gaza and what's currently going on, it is first necessary to recognize that the current conflict did not begin with Hamas' attack on October 7th, nor is it limited to Gaza alone. This is, I mean, I'm so glad to read this in mainstream. And it continues. I mean, we are not going to go through this article, but the other one. But look at what happened yesterday. The EU Parliament actually adopts a resolution calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. But Hamas must go. Okay, fine. But the EU Parliament now has mustered enough people, 300 something, to vote along with Claire Daly to actually condemn what's happening and say, like, look, Israel, you cannot slaughter all of these people anymore. You've killed more than 24,000 already. Probably 30,000 and more are dead, and tens of thousands more are wounded and mutilated for life. This has to end. The EU Parliament is highly symbolic, so this resolution itself is, of course, non-binding and so on. So the EU Parliament has literally zero power, zero. I mean, within the EU a little bit, but on external affairs, zero. So it means nothing more than it is a political statement. But that we have the political statement now. Well, my friends, that is new. And now let's go to the highlight of what has been published recently in these large media outlets at the moment, right? In The Guardian, keep that in mind. This is a Guardian article. And this article talks about how a review of internal State Department documents shows special mechanisms that have been used to shield Israel from US human rights laws. And you know how the United States doesn't care at all about international law, but how in US democratic rhetoric, in this understanding of the neocons, that they try to portray to everybody that the United States is a law-abiding society, right? And that the rule of law is paramount. This rhetoric is huge, right? And now here's an article that says that Israel has been evading domestic US law. Now, what is that law? And I had no idea that this particular law actually existed, which is why this is a really revealing article, honestly revealing, and not one of these BS kind of window dressing articles. So, top US official quietly reviewed more than a dozen incidents of alleged gross violations of human rights by Israeli security forces since 2020, but have gone to great lengths to preserve continued access to US weapons for the units responsible for the alleged violations, contributing, former US officials say, to the sense of impunity with which Israel has approached this war in Gaza. The only criticism I have of this article is that the English, the prose that this person uses, is quite dense and somewhat difficult to understand. But fine, that's probably just the journalist who writes like this. Written by one person, by the way, Stephanie Kirchgassner. Kudos to Stephanie Kirchgassner. Apparently, this article alleges that these state officials have been really doing everything in their power to actually evade a law that is in place. Now let's go to the law. Oh, something more that tells us that something is changing. I mean, look at this. This is the first article I read that does not start with 1,200 people who died on October 7th. You know how this is the mantra, how every single article in Western media had to start 3 paragraphs with telling everybody how absolutely inhumane and horrible the October 7th was, in order to then continue with like tiny little, maybe, Israel, tone it down a little bit, tiny little criticism of what Israel is doing at the moment. This article doesn't do it. This article in the second paragraph says an estimated 24,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed by Israeli forces since Hamas 7 October attack on Israel. And that's it. No more talk about October 7th. This article actually starts with the 24,000 and not with the 1,200 on October 7th. This is a complete shift in the way that the article builds toward its final argument. And of course, then also says that now Joe Biden is under attack in the United States for supporting this indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, which is exactly what is happening. So State Department officials have in effect been able to circumvent US law that is meant to prevent US complicity in human rights violations by foreign military units. Turns out there is a 1990 era so-called Leahy law. I looked up how to pronounce the name of this guy earlier, and I already can't remember. I'm very sorry. Leahy law, named after the now retired Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, because former officials say extraordinary international State Department policies have been put in place that show extreme difference to the Israeli government. No such special arrangement exists for other US allies. And the article comes back to this again and again and again. The entire article is just about that, how the United States has a law, the Leahy law, that forbids export of US weapons to places where human rights abuses are apparent or very likely, and how Israel has been shielded from that law with all kind of tricks that you can have in a toolbox to circumvent the law, right? Because laws are something serious. Even in the United States, they're somewhat of a serious matter, and getting around them ain't easy. And this article speaks about how they did that. And then the article speaks about, gives examples, of the most popular, most famous human rights abuses of the last couple of years, which are always about individuals. Most prominently, of course, the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, that Palestinian U.S. journalist, this woman here on the picture, right? The mural that was shot in 2020 in the head by Israeli forces. First, Israel blamed, of course, Hamas and Palestinian militants, but it turns out, no, it must have been the forces. I mean, video evidence and so on came out that forced even Israel to admit that a mistake had happened. And then there's other examples of people who just outrightly and provenly were killed by Israeli forces, who were no threat, who were civilians, and who were brutally murdered. Omar Assad, Ahmad Abdu, a 25-year-old. The article gives a couple of examples. And And then the article comes back again to the law, and that there actually are mechanisms in the State Department to try to understand whether a foreign partner, an ally, might be engaged in human rights abuses, because apparently this law was drafted originally for South America, and for the case of partners in South America that might themselves actually do human rights abuses on indigenous people and so on in cases against drug cartels and whatnot, and that there's actually that the usually these institutions are being vetted individually, but that for Israel, the State Department has created a so-called Israel Leahy vetting forum, which is apparently a special mechanism that then has special rules of how to figure out if Israel is engaged in human rights violations. Because under the Leahy law, for most countries and in most cases, a foreign military unit is granted US military assistance for training after it is vetted by the State Department for any reported human rights violations. The law prohibits the Department of States and the Department of Defense from providing funds, assistance, and training to foreign security forces units where there is credible information that the forces have committed a gross violation of human rights. And this, by the way, is the guy, the senator, Mr. Leahy, of Vermont. And the article then continues, and what makes me suspicious that there is actually now a shift in US foreign policies, that this article, of course, is also built on people familiar with the process. There's a lot of officials in the United States that are apparently tipping off this journalist, or the journalist has been able to access them and is now able to say this. I mean, we know this from other instances, that when there's a policy shift in the background, suddenly the media is fed with certain pieces of information from which they then can make change the narrative, basically, which is what's going on right here. So then they quote one of these unnamed officials. Nobody said it, but everyone knew the rules were different for Israel under the Leahy law. No one will ever admit it, but it's the truth, said one former State Department official. One set of domestic US laws for a couple of allies, and then another set for Israel, because Israel is so special. And we know that by now, right? It's utterly obvious. It's just this is a bit of the background story, how also in the State Department and with all the legal processes, it is possible to make Israel special. Israel must be consulted about alleged human rights violations that are under review and has 90 days to respond to claims, creating what some former officials said were significant delays. No other country's government must be consulted under State Department procedures, former officials said. So again and again, there are very special mechanisms for Israel, not in place for anybody else. And this leads to, the article says, a broad impunity. I mean, seriously, like black on white, like the article says this leads to Israel knowing that it can do whatever it wants, which of course we all know, but now we have an article about it. Some experts see a connection between the US hands-off approach to Israel on human rights violations and Israel's conduct in the war in Gaza. No shit, Sherlock. Really? Since it is utterly clear that there will be no real repercussions, Israel does whatever it wants. Yes, exactly. Israel receives $3.8 billion in military assistance every single year, and the Biden administration twice bypassed Congress last month to deliver an additional $250 million in weapons. I mean, obviously, this tells the Israeli government that they can do whatever they want and that they just do it now, right? Do it fast, do it now. But apparently, this window of opportunity is now closing because now these articles are coming out. I think Israel feels a broad impunity when it comes to consequences within the US for its actions, said Josh Paul, a former State Department official who has emerged as a vocal critic of the Biden administration policies on Israel. So this guy down here, which shows that in the administration everywhere, there is people with a moral conscience. There are people who don't want to go along with the neocons and who don't want to go along with a genocide. It's just whether or not they can actually influence policy is the question, and often they can't, and they're silenced. But right now they're not silenced. Now they are getting the megaphone. Literally, they're getting a megaphone. This article is a megaphone for this guy and the other people who want to stop the genocide. Nowhere is the US double standard on Israel more apparent than in a 2021 agreement signed between one state official and Israel. The 2-page agreement, which has received little media attention, formalized changes in the Leahy law and included a statement about how Israel has a robust, independent, and effective legal system, including its military justice system. The US signed more than 24 similar agreements with other countries at the time, including Greece, Jordan, Georgia, Ukraine, and Latvia, but none contained language endorsing the other countries' military justice system. Israel is the only one in which the agreement itself acknowledges how awesome Israel actually is and how just and impartial the military justice system is. And we know this is absolutely bogus, right? The Israel's military justice system is one of the worst and human rights committing systems in place that can detain people without trial for months on end. But of course, if you then make a state-to-state treaty like agreement and say like, okay, our justice system is so good, so you have nothing to worry about, then people in the State Department can use that in order to say like, look, we don't need to vet Israel because we already have established that Israel is fine. So this is how you can go around laws made by Congress. Like, this is a bureaucratic way of circumventing a law. This is what this article here beautifully actually explains. Tim Reiser, a longtime senior advisor to Leahy, who helped write the law in 1990s, said the inclusion of the language was probably intended to help Israel avoid scrutiny under the Leahy law, because it suggests a matter of fact that the Israeli military justice system is independent enough to address any alleged human rights violations. The military law enforcement system is used by Israel as a whitewash mechanism whose purpose is to block any criticism of Israel and the army's policies in the territories, says a pro-Palestinian, Israeli pro-Palestinian group, B'Tselem. I mean, also the sources that the people that these article interviews in order to launch criticism at Israel is incredible. I think the track record is really one of slaps on the wrist, temporary demotions and short-term suspensions, even for really serious violations, said Paul, who now talks about what the military justice system actually does to Israeli soldiers who commit horrible human rights abuses. And then again, a lot of examples are being given, of individuals killed. Again, Abu Akleh comes up, and how the military justice system in Israel has never held people truly to account. So not only does the US system not hold the Israeli government to account, the Israeli system doesn't hold its own soldiers, its IDF, to account. So it is utter, complete impunity, and here we have it. Then they talk a bit again about the Abu Akleh case, right? And how in the end nobody was punished. If the US had been willing to apply the Leahy law in Israel, the IDF would presumably have been more inclined to hold their soldiers accountable. Exactly, which would have helped deter killings of civilians like Shireen Abu Akleh and many others. And what we are seeing today, yes, nobody is held to account. The Israeli IDF, they can literally go on a killing rampage, which they have been doing, and nobody has to fear any repercussions. They're being lauded as heroes of the state, right? This is the entire crux of the problem. And although the US actually has laws in place to try to prevent that, they are being circumvented. And even so, with like very, very horrible excuses. And the Abu Akleh case, it was huge in the media, right? And an outcry. But in the end, even in the US, echoing statements by the IDF, the USCC released a short statement that there was no reason to believe that this was an intentional, but rather the result, an intentional case, but rather the result of tragic circumstances. That's the basically State Department final verdict on the killing of Abu Akleh. It was unfortunate, right? Yeah, tragic. It's like, like a tsunami. that kills people. It's tragic, but there's no need to punish anyone because obviously it's tragic and it shouldn't happen. The article gets better and better, like then going into how many reports there have been, a disturbing number of reports on all of the human rights abuses that Israel has been doing. In January 2009, in a January 2009 letter to the then Secretary Condoleezza Rice, already Leahy expressed incredulity that the State Department was unaware of a single incident involving the IDF that would trigger the Leahy law. So turns out this Leahy guy, I was completely unaware. I didn't know. This Leahy guy for 15, 20 years has been trying to have that law applied on Israel, and he was rebuffed again and again. Nothing happened. He kept sending letter after letter after letter. In a letter in May 2018 from Leahy to the then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who served in the Trump administration, Leahy sought a Leahy law review of the shooting deaths of about 100 Palestinian protesters from Gaza in the Great March of Return, who had been killed since March of that year. And it was more than 100. It was around 300 people who were killed, and another additional 1,000 that were maimed through sniper shots who shot at people in Gaza who were protesting on their side of the fence, and they were just mowed down. They were killed en masse. This is obvious human rights violations, and Leahy tried. Apparently, I would still need to talk to the guy, but apparently he tried to actually have this his law applied, and it was just ignored. So several other letters from Leahy, and this is what the article ends with, refer to gross violations of human rights by the IDF. None of the cases ever led to a unit being punished. Can you believe it, my friends? Something is seriously changing. This is a very damning report, and if this turns out to all be true, I mean, I don't know how you can get around. This is just so damning. I wasn't even aware of this law, but that the U.S. even circumvents its own laws to help Israel, and in such a blatant way. Now, I don't know what this means. I don't know what this indicates, but I do think it indicates that there now has been a shift in the U.S. and that they're now actually starting to crack down on Israel. That's what I hope. I actually hope that this is the beginning of a serious change in State Department policy when it comes to Israel to make them stop, because this is pretty tough. This is also the link from the ICJ case on genocide to individuals in the State Department who chose to actually to put policies in place, or at least mechanisms, to circumvent domestic law, to allow human rights abuses with US weapons. To me, this is quite something. I do hope it means that now the slaughter in Gaza is going to stop, because pressure on Israel is starting to become real. I don't know whether that's actually going to happen or not, but let's look out. Let's look out for this. The Leahy law. I hope I can talk to this person pretty soon. There are good people. Whether they get power or not is another question.